Hello and welcome. Many years with the feast day of Saint Photios. I am so delighted to welcome all of you, especially His Eminence Metropolitan Moses and our visiting clergy, all of our guests that came from far away, near and far, as well as all of you that are joining us remotely through Zoom, all of our virtual conference attendees. A very warm welcome to all of you for the 5th annual Seminary Conference. The theme is The Cross, 100 years of the sacred struggle. This afternoon, we have the keynote lecture being presented by Father Photii. Before we proceed to that, I will take care of a couple housekeeping items. Please, if you're here in person with us, take a moment to silence your cell phones. We do have a microphone system set up that during the Q&A session, it will pick up anything in the room. So please take a moment now to silence your cell phones. For those of you that are joining us remotely via Zoom, we will be having a Q&A, and I encourage you to submit your questions to Gabrielle. Thank you, Gabrielle, who is once again serving as our wonderful virtual conference host. So I very much appreciate all the effort that has gone on in putting this event together. So at this point, I would like to ask everybody to rise to start off with an opening prayer. Your Eminence.
O Christ, the true light, who enlightenest and sanctifies every man that cometh into the world, let the light of thy countenance be shined upon us, that in it we may see the unapproachable light, and guide our steps to the doing of thy commandments by the intercessions of thine all immaculate Mother and of all thy saints. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Your Eminence. Today's keynote lecture by Father Photii is the Third Apparition of the Precious Cross, an incentive to struggle. This is in honor of the 100-year anniversary of the third appearance of the cross over Athens in 1925. Father Photii is a Hierodeacon at the St. Gregory Palamas Monastery here in Etna, California. He is a graduate of and an instructor at the St. Photios Orthodox Theological Seminary, where he is also currently working on his master's degree. Father Photii is a beloved instructor for the undergraduate students. He specializes in very engaging and dynamic church history. He has Church History 1 and 2. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Father Photii as he comes up to the podium. Thank you.
Your Eminence and Your Eminence bless, Reverend Fathers bless, and all our listeners, good afternoon. Confucius said, if you think in terms of a year, plant a seed. If in terms of a decade, plant a tree. If in terms of a century, teach the people. This year marks the auspicious centennial of the Third Apparition of the Precious Cross, and it is the goal of my lecture to answer the question, what is the meaning of this event for Orthodox Christians of today? In his book, Frequently Asked Questions about the Genuine Orthodox Christians, Dr. Dimitrios Alibertis describes the Third Apparition thus. In the midst of the trials that the traditionalists were enduring, a miraculous event transpired in 1925, shortly after the onset of the intense persecutions that would positively alter the course of the Greek Old Calendar movement. on the night of September 13th, Old Style, through to the early hours of September 14th, more than 2,000 old calendarists had assembled at the country church of St. John the Theologian, located on Mount Imitos, to hold a monastic-style vigil for the feast of the universal elevation of the precious cross of the Lord. Georgios Kondilis, Minister of the Interior at the time, sent a platoon of police headed by a lieutenant to disperse the assembly and to arrest the serving priest, the ever-memorable Presbyter Ioannis Floros. When the platoon arrived, the police did not proceed with the orders to arrest the priest because of the number of people present. As such, the lieutenant and the policeman went off to the side and quietly waited for services to finish, so they could proceed with the arrest. As Father Ioannis was finishing the DT at around 11:30 p.m., there was suddenly a large commotion, and the masses began shouting. The lieutenant and the policeman immediately ran to see what was going on. They were dumbfounded with the vision before their eyes. Above the church was a radiant white cross that appeared in an east-west direction. Such was the brilliance of this cross that the stars of the sky were no longer visible, and the light of the cross showered the church, its courtyard, and the faithful. All fell to their knees and cried out hymns and doxologies to our Lord. Ioannis the Iglimis, one of the police cadets who was present there that night to assist with the dispersion of the faithful, testified. Then we also looked up and saw the wonder, a massive, brightly shining cross very high up over the church, lighting the entire area. In the beginning we were seized with fear, but immediately we recovered and fell down on our knees, forgetting our mission and crying like small children. It is superfluous, of course, to tell you that we followed the sacred vigil until the end, filled with compunction, no longer as persecuting members, but as faithful Christians. In the morning, when we returned to the academy, we related to everyone the great miracle that we were fortunate to see. Subsequently, there were interrogations, and all of us testified under oath that we saw very clearly the precious cross high up in the sky. While the light emanating from the cross showered the church and the people, the cross itself was visible to many, even far away. Athanasios Ioannis Primalis, a trolleybus driver in downtown Athens, was driving his last route that night when he was deemed worthy, along with many other Athenians, to witness the miracle. He said, "That night in 1925, in which the precious cross appeared, I was doing the last route as a trolleybus driver. I had reached Omonia Square and did my round there when I saw the people looking toward the sky and yelling out, 'Look, the cross, the cross!' I immediately stepped on the brakes and stopped the vehicle. I stuck my head outside of the door of the vehicle, and I, the unworthy one, also saw the precious cross of our Lord, may his name be glorified, shining brilliantly over Imitos. I do not recall how long this lasted. I know only one thing, that the precious cross which I saw that night made me a different man. From then on, everyone in my family, we became faithful children of the Church of the genuine Orthodox Christians." This phenomenon was visible for about 30 minutes before it began to fade away slowly. The service finished at 4 a.m., and the people returned to their towns and homes, carrying with them the joyful tidings of all that had transpired. Truly, the third apparition of the precious cross was a great source of consolation and strength to those enduring severe persecutions from the Church of Greece, working alongside political authorities. While the Holy Cross showed its invincible power that night by safeguarding Father Ioannis and his flock, and by allowing the divine services to go through to completion undisturbed, perhaps the greatest miracle of that night was that those who were previously frightful persecutors became, after the event, defenders of traditional orthodoxy. Many who were present at the Church of St. John the Theologian during that blessed night recorded their testimonies for future generations. In the second half of this talk, I will focus more on the significance of this event for Orthodox Christians of today. But before we move on to that, it seems appropriate to focus on the time period when the other two apparitions of the precious cross occurred, the 4th century. The first apparition of the precious cross occurred in the year 312, shortly before St. Constantine's victory over the tyrant Maxentius at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. It was seen by the Holy Emperor and led St. Constantine to become the protector and advocate of the Christian faith, and served as a catalyst for the spread of Christianity in the empire. The second apparition of the precious cross began on May 7th, 351 in Jerusalem. As with the first apparition, it happened during the day and outshone the sun. This second apparition lasted for about a week and became a cause of conversion to Christianity of many Jews and pagans, and also confirmed the Orthodox in their struggle against Arianism. I would like to elaborate on this struggle against Arianism. This year marks yet another momentous anniversary, exactly 1700 years since the first ecumenical synod in Nicaea was held in the year 325. In anticipation of a triumphant and celebratory mood, I think it is worth remembering a few things. Although the first ecumenical synod was a dogmatic victory over the Arian heresy, it was only the beginning of the struggle against this heresy. There were several reasons for this. First, we must realize that Arians did not call themselves Arians. Arian bishops considered it an insult to be named after a presbyter, which Arius was. They called themselves Orthodox and put a lot of emphasis on officialdom. After the first ecumenical synod, Arians knew that they could not openly oppose the decisions of the Great Synod in Nicaea, so they resorted to political intrigue in order to gain control of major episcopal sees and oust champions of the faith, such as St. Athanasius in Alexandria and St. Eustathius in Antioch. Then the Arians tried to diminish the dogmatic importance of the first ecumenical synod. This is where things got tricky. We have to understand that the term homoousios, of one essence, which was used in Nicaea to describe the relationship between the divine hypostases of the Father and the Son, was rather innovative, theologically speaking. St. Athanasius the Great was divinely inspired, both spiritually and intellectually, to use the term because it was the only term which could expose Arius' heresy, which claimed that Christ was not truly God. Arius had no problem using biblical language when speaking about Christ. He simply interpreted it in his own way, that Christ was not fully divine. But Arius simply could not bring himself to say that Christ was of one essence with the Father. This phrase, of one essence, showed the equality between the Father and the Son so clearly that Arius could not accept it at all. Thus, of one essence became the phrase which forced Arians to admit that they did not really believe that Christ was God, and hence were not really Christians. However, there was a problem. As I mentioned, homoousios, of one essence, was innovative. Not that it was a new dogma. After all, there were earlier fathers of the Church who defended the foundational dogma of the full divinity of Christ. But of one essence was simply a new way of explaining this dogma in order to protect people from heresy. However, not all Orthodox were happy with the term, and there was a reason for this. Although the phrase of one essence was effective against Arians who tried to sunder the Holy Trinity, it was not as effective against a heresy which attacked the Church in the previous century, monarchianism. While Arianism did away with the Trinity by claiming that Christ was not truly God, monarchianism did away with the Trinity by lumping the three hypostases into one. Monarchianism, as its name betokens, basically turned the Trinity into a monad. Given this historical background, it is not surprising that many of the fathers of the Church were reticent about using the term of one essence, because, according to them, the term did not provide enough distinction between the hypostases of the Father and the Son, and could be misused in a way that merged the two into one. So the situation after the First Ecumenical Synod was this. There were Arians who opposed the term of one essence because they did not believe that Christ was truly God. There were also Orthodox who opposed the term of one essence, not because they denied that Christ was truly God, but because they were being cautious with regards to another heresy, monarchianism. I think everyone can already guess that this situation caused a massive confusion. Mind you, this was not because the Orthodox were being pedantic. Both the Orthodox who supported the term of one essence and the Orthodox who opposed it believed and confessed the full divinity of the Son. But as the Church was being attacked on various sides, there was a difference of opinion as to which side must be defended more emphatically. In any case, the Arians exploited this situation, and because, as I mentioned previously, they simply called themselves Orthodox, it was often hard to tell who was who. A good example of this was the case of Saint Meletios of Antioch. In the early 360s, a group of moderate Arians enthroned a new bishop at Antioch, the great Saint Meletios. Now, the interesting thing is that the Orthodox were also supportive of this election, since Saint Meletios was known for such a high level with his hand. I must make a necessary digression for a moment. I know that nowadays there are people who try to use the 4th century in order to say that Orthodox faithful should not sever communion with bishops or synods of bishops who are preaching heresy, specifically ecumenism. Such people reason that one should fight heresy from within, as it were, by maintaining communion with those who preach heresy. Even a rudimentary knowledge of church history shows that such a position is untenable. Yes, in the 4th century there were times when Orthodox were in communion with heretics, but this was only because the situation was very complex and it was difficult to tell who was who. Furthermore, as soon as they found out who was who, the Orthodox would immediately sever communion with those suspected of heresy. After St. Meletios' enthronement, there was a break in communion between the Arians and St. Meletios. In fact, the Arians quickly set about trying to exile the very bishop whom they had just appointed. In addition, even Orthodox jurisdictions were sometimes not in communion with each other, because they were not always sure about each other's orthodoxy. To give an example, St. Meletios of Antioch was never in communion with St. Athanasius the Great, despite the fact that their episcopal tenures overlapped for about 13 years. And this was in the latter part of the 4th century. Think about it. The champion of the First Ecumenical Synod, St. Athanasius, was not in communion with the future president of the Second Ecumenical Synod, St. Meletios. Orthodox have been so cautious about not communing with heretics that, if there is doubt, they sever communion until it is clear what someone preaches. I might add that this is not only incumbent on bishops. While still a presbyter, St. Basil the Great severed communion with his bishop because the latter's orthodoxy was suspect. In the 5th century, when Nestorius started to preach his heresy in Constantinople, many of the laity simply walked out of the church and immediately severed communion with him. Of course, such drastic action must be taken only for the sake of maintaining the purity of the faith against heresy. Otherwise, it becomes a schism, which is no better than heresy. But when it is a matter of faith, when it is for the sake of opposing heresy, severing communion with those who preach heresy is standard operating procedure and a requirement, not an option. There are canons about this, and the examples of such action are so numerous in the church history that I should not have to emphasize this point, but I do have to emphasize it because of individuals who mislead many faithful with regards to this. But let us return to our subject. Though many Orthodox struggled martyrically during the difficult times of the 4th century, I want to focus on the work of St. Basil the Great, who was arguably the one who labored most for the establishment of peace in the Church. I want to focus on St. Basil because he will serve as a perfect example of how to act during times when heresy is attacking the Church, and he must be emulated in our struggle against ecumenism. St. Basil the Great was active during the second part of the 4th century. He was very well educated and was chosen as Archbishop of Caesarea and Cappadocia in the year 370. He is a beloved saint of the Church and is known as a liturgist, a theologian, the composer of numerous beautiful prayers, the establisher of guidelines for the monastic life, the one who established the first hospitals, and the list goes on. When I think of St. Basil, I usually think of an eagle who soars high above the bustle of the world and sees the entire situation clearly. The first thing that St. Basil noticed was that there were many Orthodox who were separated from each other not because they believed differently, but because they preferred different terminology. He understood that the Orthodox had to unite if they were to overcome Arianism. And in order to facilitate this union, he perfected theological terminology. He thus set about getting all the Orthodox on the same page. But this was not an easy task. Unfortunately, most Orthodox in the West did not really bother to try and understand the complicated situation in the East. According to them, anyone who was opposed to the phrase of one essence was a heretic. To this day, in Western scholarly sources, the Orthodox who originally opposed the term of one essence are inappropriately called semi-Arians. This attitude of the majority of the western part of the church caused a lot of unnecessary problems for the Orthodox who were struggling in the East. But even worse was the damage that such an attitude caused to Christianity in the West. By approaching a difficult situation with indiscretion and bombastic accusations of heresy, for the most part, the West never understood theological terminology in a deep way. They accepted it passively, but without the deep knowledge which comes with having to struggle with theological problems. Subsequent history showed that, in general, the West was always a step behind in understanding theological issues. Despite numerous setbacks, such as the above mentioned, St. Basil painstakingly worked for the union of all Orthodox, with his labors culminating in the convocation of the Second Ecumenical Synod in the year 381, which finally put an end to Arianism in the East. That was with regards to the Orthodox camp. But St. Basil was also concerned about bringing the heretics back into the fold of the Church. The Arians, by default, denied the divinity of the Holy Spirit. Basically, if you deny that Christ is God, whose divinity is proclaimed so many times in the New Testament, then forget about the divinity of the Holy Spirit, about whom much less is written explicitly. St. Basil wrote the work On the Holy Spirit, in which he basically tried to show the divinity of the Holy Spirit in every way except for explicitly saying the Holy Spirit is God. He wrote this work in order gently to coax the heretics back to the truth. In addition, on a certain feast day, when numerous bishops from neighboring dioceses gathered for a celebration, St. Basil delivered a sermon. In it, he spoke openly about the divinity of the Son, but was rather subdued about proclaiming the divinity of the Holy Spirit, because he saw that certain heretics had come to the celebration. This attitude of St. Basil scandalized some of the Orthodox, who even went to St. Athanasius the Great and complained to him about St. Basil's lukewarmness as they perceived it. But St. Athanasius answered them decisively that the genuine servant of God Basil stands for the truth no less than they, but for the sake of the weak he became as the weak, that he might gain the weak. Basil is the pride of the Church, and they should thank God who gave Cappadocia such a bishop, whom any land would desire to have. How true are these words, and a proper rebuke to scandalmongers. It is easy to call people heretics, but to actually discern a situation, to be able to explain it to others, and gently to bring back those in error to the truth, this requires effort and patience, and there are few who do this. But it is the proper way. In short, St. Basil became all things to all men. I have focused on the 4th century because, for the most part, we like our history sugar-coated. Because of this, we do not learn from history, and we also deprive ourselves of the consolation which comes from seeing what great obstacles were overcome in the past. In the 9th century, as Patriarch of Constantinople, one year, St. Photius delivered a series of 5 sermons on the 5 Sundays of the Great Fast, in which he covered the struggle against Arianism from beginning to end. They were delivered in the great church of Hagia Sophia and were basically lessons on church history, with a little exhortation at the end of how these historical events related to his time. Unfortunately, only 2 of the sermons have come down to us, but they are enough to show how many important lessons can be learned by studying the struggle against Arianism. But let us leave the 4th century and return to the topic with which we started, the third apparition of the precious cross, which occurred in the 20th century. As genuine Orthodox Christians, we must ask ourselves, what is the meaning of this event for us? First of all, if the third apparition of the precious cross is for us simply a matter of confirming our correctness, we are missing the point. The third apparition of the precious cross is an incentive to struggle. I spoke at length about the 4th century for a reason. I set up the life of St. Basil as a high standard to which we must aspire. If we are honest with ourselves, in general, we are far from that standard. Which is why I would like to propose a strategy by which we can get closer to that standard. First, let me clarify what was at stake during the time of the third apparition in 1925. In essence, ecumenism is an effort to unite various Christian denominations. but for orthodoxy, which is the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, unique and undivided, unity among Christian denominations entails the return to orthodoxy of these various denominations which, throughout the centuries, have separated themselves from the one Church. But starting from the earliest years of the 20th century, various patriarchs of Constantinople approached ecumenism not in an orthodox way. They began the ecumenical venture by systematically eroding Orthodox self-identity, in order that the one true Church would come to resemble more closely the various heterodox which had fallen away from her over the centuries. Basically, the ecumenist ecumenical patriarchs had and have as their goal to unite orthodoxy to the heterodox by stripping orthodoxy of its unique position as the one and only true Church. The term Old Calendarist is actually a pejorative term intended to denigrate the sacred struggle. The sentiment behind it is, you are making a big fuss over a secondary issue of a few days on the calendar. But this is misleading. We have to realize that when the ecumenical patriarchate in Constantinople introduced a new calendar into its liturgical life in the 1920s, this was but one of many actions taken to dissolve Orthodox self-identity and make it easier to unite with Western Christianity. The attack on the patristic calendar was part of a greater assault on basic Orthodox piety, which included forbidding the faithful to hold vigils, moving feast days to the weekends if they happened to fall in the middle of the week, forcibly shaving old calendarist priests, cutting their hair and stripping them of their rasa, and so on. The point is that in an attempt to emulate the Western Christian confessions, the ecumenists began a violent assault on basic Orthodox piety, so that their ecumenical venture would go more smoothly. There was a good dose of hypocrisy in this as well, because when sending letters to non-Orthodox Christians, the ecumenist Orthodox would emphasize how they need to unite in order to confront the growing secularization in the world. But at home, these same ecumenist Orthodox were rapidly trying to secularize the Orthodox Church. And so, the calendar is not the only issue, and it is not the main issue either. The main issue is the heresy of ecumenism, which is an assault on the dogma of the true Church, as expressed in the holy symbol of faith, whereas the introduction of the new calendar was a big step, and not the only one, towards this heresy. And ecumenism is not simply a heresy, but a pan-heresy. It is a pan-heresy because, whereas previous heresies claim to preserve the true teaching of the Church, ecumenism subverts the very idea of a true Church. And so, although the Orthodox have accepted the insult of Old Calendarists as a badge of honor, we must realize that essentially we are neither Old Calendarists nor traditional. There is no such a thing as a conservative or liberal or orthodoxy. There is only one orthodoxy. And the genuine Orthodox are just that, Orthodox Christians. But given our historical context, titles such as Old Calendarist, Traditionalist, Genuine are not superfluous. They are legitimately used to distinguish our identity from those who would compromise the faith. I might mention also that to designate genuine Orthodox as Old Calendarist is not accurate, since most official Orthodox, numerically speaking, follow the old calendar even to this day, as in the case of the Patriarchate of Jerusalem, Mount Athos, and the Russian Church. But how did ecumenism creep into the Orthodox Church? If we are to answer this question comprehensively, we must take a step back and look at the whole picture. Ecumenism was not just a product of the 20th century. Rather, it was a product of centuries of erosion of Orthodox theology. And although many factors played a role, one of the biggest factors which contributed to the spread of ecumenism was that for centuries, Orthodox theology was in a state of captivity. After the fall of Constantinople under the Ottoman yoke, if the Greeks wanted to get a higher education, they had to do so in the universities of Western Europe. Higher education was forbidden to the Greeks in the Ottoman Empire because of their subjugated position. The result was that even if Orthodox theologians maintained their faith, which for the most part they did, they nonetheless adopted Western theological models which distorted genuine patristic theology. In Russia, influenced by the Latinizing infiltration of the Jesuits and entrenched during the Petrine reforms of the early 18th century, A Western model and ideas were adopted for theological education. Unfortunately, the patristic theology of the Church was undermined by a Western scholastic theological schema, and so there came to dominate what is now called the theological captivity, which, although not absolute, was nonetheless pervasive. This is why, all too often, Orthodox faithful are suspicious of theological education. But theological education is not the problem. The problem is a wrong theological education. And this wrong theological education can only be countered by a proper patristic theological education. We must reflect on this and realize what mission our seminary has been given in the grand scheme of things. When we realize what position the St. Photios Orthodox Theological Seminary holds in the history of the Church, how, after centuries of waiting, genuine patristic theology can again be taught without extraneous constraints and influences, we should be humbled by the great task entrusted to us by God. We should also realize what a grave responsibility has been laid on our shoulders. Our work is to reverse centuries of theological erosion. One eminent theologian rightly pointed out that we have Augustinian theology running through our veins. This is absolutely true. We need a blood transfusion. Yes, this sounds radical, but I guarantee you that many students in the seminary, when they first encounter the mind of the Fathers, are shocked, if not scandalized. Some even wonder whether the Fathers of the Church were Christian in their outlook. That is the result of centuries of theological captivity, that the Fathers of the Church do not even sound Christian to us. But in order to confront the heresy of ecumenism effectively, we must acquire the mind of the Fathers. That is how we confront heresy effectively, not by bombastic accusations which lack substance. We must acquire the mind of the Fathers, but how are we to do so when it is hard even to find a good translation of the Fathers in English? I know from experience that a good, accurate translation of the Fathers of the Church in English is a rarity. The reason for this is simple. Translation is interpretation. But for the most part, Western Christians are not able to interpret the Fathers correctly. They come across a passage from the Fathers, and it sounds so alien to them that they mistranslate it to make it fit their worldview. Knowledge of the language is not the issue. The problem is that the translator comes across a saying of the Fathers and thinks that it is impossible that a Christian could write something like that, and so deliberately mistranslates it. For example, in one of his orations, St. Gregory the Theologian says that man, creation, is the portion of God, which flowed down from God. The translator thinks, what? That's pantheism. I can't translate that literally. Rather than first try and understand why St. Gregory the Theologian would say something like that. In order to understand the Fathers, one needs to immerse oneself in the mind of the Fathers, which engages one's entire being. The study of the Fathers is a spiritual exercise and requires guidance and direction. It is precisely such direction that the St. Photios Seminary offers. When we speak of studying the Fathers in a formal way, we do not mean to imply anything mechanistic. Rather, we mean that such study is done with guidance, which is of paramount importance. Without direction, one can read the Fathers all his life and still miss the point, and this is tragic. However, even the formal aspect of education is of great importance. Even what is called the secular aspect of learning, developing critical thinking skills, being able to express oneself cogently, following academic rigor. All of these skills are of great value to the Church. Why? Because although education is often seen as a secular pursuit, undertaken for personal enhancement, such a view forgets an important point. Education benefits others. An educated person who can guide people to the truth is performing an act of love. He is showing care for the salvation of his neighbor. The Church has a crying need for well-educated faithful. It is worth emphasizing again that it was St. Basil's theological eminence which enabled him to recognize that there were Orthodox who were divided among themselves because of terminology. It was St. Basil's education which enabled him to find the terminology which would be accepted by all Orthodox, and thus to bring about union among Orthodox jurisdictions. Hence, the first step that we must take as genuine Orthodox Christians is to recognize the necessity for theological education and to support it with zeal. A proper patristic theological education is an indispensable precondition if we are to make progress in our struggle against ecumenism. The next step is related to the first. Acquiring the mind of the fathers is synonymous with acquiring the mind of Christ. Christ desires that all be saved and come to a knowledge of the truth. It was this desire which fueled St. Basil's exertions for the sake of unity and bringing those in error back to the truth. It will be remembered that in the 4th century there were Christians who were very quick to brand others as heretics, Christians who had little patience for nuance and subtlety. Such is not the way of the great fathers of the Church. The great fathers of the Church, such as St. Basil, exerted themselves even for those in heresy. If someone is in heresy, this is not an opportunity for name-calling. Even worse is calling people heretics who are not actually so. I am stressing this point because jurisdictional triumphalism, condemnation of others, and character assassination have been the unfortunate shadows following the sacred old calendar's struggle for the faith. Unfortunately, these evils have caused schisms and have marred the image of the old calendar's struggle. And all these ills stem primarily from ignorance and lack of Christian comportment. But such ills are not a new phenomenon. In the 4th century, St. Basil lamented about the same evils as he compared the condition of the Church to a naval battle fought at night. He wrote, quote, "But what storm at sea was ever so fierce and wild as this tempest of the churches? In it, every landmark of the fathers has been moved, every foundation, every bulwark of opinion has been shaken. We attack one another, we are overthrown by one another. If our enemy is not the first to strike us, we are wounded by the comrade at our side. There is at least this bond of union between us, that we hate our common foes. But no sooner has the enemy gone by than we find enemies in one another. The love of many has waxed cold, brotherly concord is destroyed, the very name of unity is ignored, brotherly admonitions are heard no more, nowhere is there Christian pity, nowhere falls the tear of sympathy. Now there is no one to receive the weak in faith, but mutual hatred has blazed so high among fellow clansmen that they are more delighted at a neighbor's fall than at their own success." End quote. Times of heresy bring about confusion. During such times, it often happens that even some Orthodox are not in communion with each other. It is the proverbial fog of war. Now, during the fog of war, the most reckless thing to do is to shoot at anything that moves. The wisest thing to do is to figure out who is who and to act with discretion. It is also very interesting that in the 4th century, after the dust had settled, it turned out that there were not nearly as many Arians as was previously thought by some. We must remember, Arians put a lot of emphasis on officialdom, on appearances, on numerical superiority, and so on. They resorted to nefarious means in order to acquire legitimacy. But after the hard work was done by Orthodox theologians, after the Arian delusion was systematically exposed, it became clear that Arianism was pitifully weak. But the hard work which accomplished the triumph of orthodoxy was not done by those who resorted to name-calling, but by those great fathers who with patience and love worked tirelessly for the union of the faithful. In one of his letters, St. Basil wrote, quote, "I think that those who serve the Lord sincerely and truly ought to have this one ambition, to bring back to unity the churches which have been sundered from each other at sundry times and in divers manners. For nothing belongs so peculiarly to a Christian as being a peacemaker, and therefore the only Lord has promised the greatest reward for it." End quote. All of this leads me to a thought. It is my personal opinion, but I do not believe that there are nearly as many ecumenists as we might think. Many faithful in official orthodoxy are deliberately kept ignorant of what their hierarchs are doing. Why do you think so many of the decisions regarding ecumenical activity are made in countries like Switzerland, far away from traditionally Orthodox countries? The ecumenists do not want to have a revolt on their hands. This is why I emphasize the importance of a well-informed balance and, most importantly, loving witness to genuine orthodoxy, which we must cultivate. We have yet to penetrate into the deep mystery of love as exemplified by St. Basil the Great, who put even his reputation as an Orthodox Christian on the line in order to bring those in error back to the truth. St. Basil was truly a universal father. His funeral bore a witness to this. Massive crowds of Christians, Jews, and pagans came to mourn him who was a father to them all. Which brings me to the final step of our strategy. An unfortunate byproduct of ecumenism has been that the old calendarists have often adopted a bunker-down mentality. Persecution and marginalization lead people to close in on themselves. This is natural. This is a natural protective reaction. In addition, the destructive way in which Orthodox ecumenists have interacted with the world has prompted a reactionary lack of concern for the world and a certain insularity among some old calendarists. Though, given the circumstances, this overreaction is understandable, it is not an appropriate stance for Orthodox Christians. Such a stance forgets the true parameters of the Church. Let me explain. While promoting religious syncretism, in one of his speeches, the Dalai Lama said, "One religion cannot satisfy millions of people." As Orthodox Christians, we fundamentally cannot agree with such a statement. Orthodoxy can satisfy millions of people. Actually, orthodoxy is the only thing that can satisfy all people. The goal of orthodoxy, of the Church, is to return creation to its divine origin. Fundamentally, orthodoxy is the therapy by which the fall is remedied and the entire creation is restored to its proper place within God, as Christ's body. Thus, the seemingly exclusive stance of the genuine Orthodox stems from a desire to preserve the method by which all creation can fulfill the meaning of its existence, which is union with God. But if you really think about it, this is the broadest inclusivity. There is only one way for creation to unite with God, by becoming part of the theanthropic organism of the Church, by becoming Christ's body. The trite expression, "we all have the same God," is actually true, but the implications are different depending on your perspective. There is one true God, our God in Trinity, and there is one common human nature. That means there is one path towards such a God. If all religions were paths to God, that would make God schizophrenic. But we cannot admit such blasphemy. St. Philip of New York gave the following image. Imagine there is a row of clocks on a wall, but only one tells the correct time. The fact that the other clocks were meant to tell the correct time is absolutely irrelevant to the person who actually wants to know the correct time. Now, it cannot be denied that various religions contain vestiges of truth. But the whole point of orthodoxy is that close enough is not good enough. You have to be on the mark. It will be remembered that the Greek word for sin, amartia, means to miss the mark, and was originally a term applied to javelin throwing. The whole idea of sin, of evil, is not that it is some totally different entity opposite to goodness. Rather, its existence is parasitic. It feeds on goodness by perverting and twisting goodness. That is why evil does not have ontological existence. I'll give an example. As we know from numerous accounts of church tradition, the devil often complains that God is unjust, since he forgives sinners many times over, while the devil remains a castaway because of a single transgression. You can see that even the devil has a sense of justice, but it is perverted because the only one who impedes reconciliation with God is the devil himself, since he refuses to repent. In addition, we know that the devil is terribly jealous of humans when they unite with God. But think about it. You are only jealous because of something that you really want for yourself. As is evident, even the devil has not been able to completely eradicate from himself the desire for God. And so, I repeat, close enough is not good enough. Orthodoxy's goal is precise. As man, I accomplish the goal of my existence. I hit the mark by uniting with God. This direct access to God is found only in orthodoxy. As for the rest, to what degree they draw nearer to or further from God, that is irrelevant. Life is too short for detours. I know the way, I follow it, and I invite others to follow it. But the tragedy is that while the world is longing for truth, longing for God, Orthodox ecumenists, through their religious relativism, turn people away from the truth, away from God. We as genuine Orthodox must feel responsibility for the world. We have retreated into a bunker-down mentality, but this should not be the case. In our times, when the world is going through a meaning crisis, religious relativism is especially pernicious. The world is looking for something real, something true. For a good millennium now, the Western, dry, scholastic, juridical concept of God has always provoked resentment. Such a concept of God does not resonate with humans. It does not resonate because it is not true. It is a distorted caricature of God. By the 19th century, Western society was ready to smash this caricature. Atheism was the natural reaction to the Western caricature of God. At the dawn of the 20th century, Western society plunged headlong into materialism, thinking that humanity's ills will be resolved by advances in technology. But the bloody 20th century and now the bloody 21st century have, to a great extent, shattered such a fantasy. The most common feature of humanity today is depression. Tragically, ecumenist Orthodox, rather than witnessing to the truth, have relativized and trivialized the notion of truth by aping the very heresies which have brought about such ills in society to begin with. But the whole beauty of Orthodoxy is that it is not conjecture. We do not try to fit God into our preconceived notions. Rather, in Orthodoxy, we base ourselves on the experience of how God actually is, and how He is also beyond any isness. We are so staunch in our view of the uniqueness of Orthodoxy because we base our position on genuine experience of God. The saddest part about Orthodox ecumenists is that by their actions they show that they have not really tapped deeply into the deifying energies of God. Had they done so, they would have exclaimed with St. Thomas, "My Lord and my God," and would have called all people to participate in this experience of God, just as the apostles did. So the third step of our strategy is this. We must manifest the beauty of Orthodoxy in our lives and teachings in order to give hope to our despairing world. At this point, let me summarize our entire strategy. In commemoration of the 1700 years since the First Ecumenical Synod, I have offered the life of St. Basil for us to emulate. We saw that our first step was to acquire vision of the grand picture, to realize the central place of theological education in the Church, by which we immerse ourselves in the mind of the Fathers, and how indispensable formal theological education is. Our second step was closely linked to the first. We analyzed the responsibility we have to use our theological formation in order to bring those in error back to the truth. And we saw how much patience, gentleness, and love is required in order to accomplish this. Our third step focused on the universal message of Orthodoxy and how we must not neglect our duty towards suffering humanity at large. The bottom line is this. The common attribute of all three apparitions of the Precious Cross is that all three of them converted unbelievers to the truth. And for our part, we need to penetrate into and make our own the great mystery of the cross, by which the tortured God spreads out His hands to embrace and restore fallen man. To repeat, although the third apparition of the Precious Cross offers much consolation for and the confirmation of the genuine Orthodox, it is mostly an incentive to struggle. In a sermon on the third apparition of the Precious Cross, delivered 7 years ago, Metropolitan Hierondios of Piraeus and Salamina emphasized this point by saying, quote, "From 1924 and from many decades thereafter, the comfort and ease that we enjoy today were not to be had. In those days, it was not possible for the genuine Christians to express themselves freely as we do today. Yesterday's Christians were under persecution. They sought out ways in which they could fulfill their religious duties, attending church in small chapels in the mountains and in isolated areas, always in fear and in utter secrecy. It is nearing a century since the wondrous event of the third apparition of the cross occurred, when God sealed and strengthened the faith of all of these people who in the most adverse conditions sought to keep it alive. In today's epoch, however, contemporary faithful have changed their hierarchy of needs. People in our day have placed the priorities of daily life above all else, seeking, struggling for, and worrying solely about subsistence. They leave their faith in dormancy and bit by bit forget about God. Yet in these days when ecumenism, religious syncretism, and other ills of the new age are at their peak, our mission is even more essential. We do not have the luxury of wasting our time on inessential skirmishes." End quote. That is why I have set up the struggles of St. Basil as an icon and a schema to be emulated in our day and be spurred on by seeing how much we fall short of his accomplishments. St. Basil reposed fairly young. He was only 49 years old, and yet he accomplished so much for the Church. Think about it. Although we have remnants of other heresies even to this day, the Nestorians, the Monophysites, and others, yet there is no Arian Church. The more I study the 4th century, the more I am convinced that this is in large part due to the extraordinary struggles for unity of the great fathers such as St. Basil. In our times, the God-pleasing union of the GOC and the Synod of Resistance in 2014 was a momentous step for the genuine Orthodox, and one that St. Basil, who worked so tirelessly for such unions, would be pleased about. And this union has borne much fruit already. But this is only the beginning. We must keep building on this foundation. The situation in the 21st century is complicated, just as in the 4th century. But let us see to it that the 21st century sees the ultimate triumph of orthodoxy as in the 4th century. This would be the only worthy way to honor our forefathers in the faith who beheld the precious cross in the sky a century ago. And they are worthy of honor, as is evident from the following incident in the life of the elder Father Chrysanthos, who lived during the 20th century. One time, a New Calendarist bishop came to Elder Chrysanthos and insisted that he use the new liturgical calendar. Elder Chrysanthos categorically refused to deny the traditional patristic calendar and to switch to the new calendar. This unwavering stance threw the bishop into a rage, at which point he picked up a letter opener and stabbed Elder Chrysanthos in the eye. Father Chrysanthos simply took a handkerchief and pressed it to his gouged out eye in order to stanch the profuse flow of blood. The bishop left, and on returning to his residence, expected the police to show up and arrest him at any moment for committing such a crime. But no such thing happened. Elder Chrysanthos did not retaliate. Stunned by such surpassing Christian comportment, the bishop went back to Elder Chrysanthos and repented, saying, "I gouge out your eye. I am not worthy to be a bishop. I should be in jail, whereas you did not call the authorities. You did not turn me in." From that moment on, Elder Chrysanthos became the bishop's spiritual father, and the bishop would come to him for confession. As for Elder Chrysanthos, although he lost one eye, he had acquired spiritual vision, since he was granted the gift of prophecy and foresaw many future events. He also brought many people to orthodoxy. As we reflect on the examples of our forefathers in the faith, both of recent times and of olden days, we might be overwhelmed by the high standards set before us, by the sacrifice required in order to witness to the faith with genuine love. Some might ask, who are we to undertake such apostolic and martyric struggles? I understand such a sentiment, but I have a little secret which will help us to make some progress. I have saved a little treat for the end, which will sweeten everything for us, including, hopefully, your endurance of listening to me for so long. Our all-good triune God is not bound by any constraints, such as some offended sense of justice, which would require the Son of God to be slain. Banish the thought. However, God is basically bound by his own love. God's love is so beyond comprehension that although he is perfect love, he nonetheless could, and he is perfect love because, as Saint Nikolai of Ohrid tells us, he is Trinity, so he shares this love, and that love is not selfish. So it is perfect love. But he nonetheless could not help but share his divinity, his divine life with someone else. He could not just keep it for himself, and hence the origin of creation. And although this creation has been rendered ugly by the fall, original sin, rather than defining an innately sinful nature of the human, serves to bring him to an awareness of his innate divinity. In the Church, creation returns to the divinity from which it departed and for which it longs. And so, what shall we render unto the Lord for all that he hath rendered unto us? By pondering on God's all-good providence for us, we can inflame our gratitude to God to such an extent that our struggles will not even seem to us to be struggles. If our life becomes one long Eucharist, nothing will be difficult for us. But because this might seem impossible, I will finish with a quote from St. Elizabeth, the Grand Duchess of Russia, whose personal cross included piecing together her husband's body blown up by an assassin's bomb. She said, "In my life I had so much joy, in my sorrows so much boundless comfort, that I long to give a little of that to others. I long to thank and thank every minute for all God gave me, and long to bring my feeble gratitude by serving him and his suffering children. I do not for 1 minute think I have taken up an ascetic struggle. It is a joy. I neither see my crosses nor feel them, because of the boundless kindness of God I have always felt. I long to thank him." Thank you very much for your attention.
Put the chairs in the middle. Thank you so much, Father Photii, for such edifying, thought-provoking, and truly inspiring presentation. I thank all of you again for joining us, and everybody that has joined us via the virtual conference on Zoom. Thank you so much. We will be proceeding on with the Q&A session. Glory be to God. Here at the seminary, we have continued to invest in technology. And this year, for this conference, we have the new sound bar there. So there will not be a microphone passed around. It will pick up your voice. So please do raise your hand and wait to be called on, and we'll take questions. For those of you that are joining us on YouTube, you can send your questions to ask@spots.edu, ask@spots.edu. However, I will note that we are giving preference and priority to our in-person conference attendees and our virtual conference attendees that registered. If you would like to register for the rest of the conference, it will only be offered through Zoom, and the lectures are recorded and will be distributed. So if you are in a different time zone or have a conflict with your schedule, if you register, you will still have access to the rest of the conference. Tomorrow, we have 2 lectures specific to the conference. The first, St. Chrysostomos, the New Confessor, and the Restoration of Church Traditions by Father Yidi. And tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock Pacific, the Appearance of the Cross in Our Lives, which will be a much more pastoral exploration of how we're supposed to react when the cross doesn't appear in the sky, but appears in our life, and how do we best pick it up and carry it following after Christ. For those that are part of the virtual conference, in between the two lectures, there will be a Q&A session specifically for the virtual conference attendees while everybody here is getting a tour of the convent of St. Elizabeth. If you have a question that isn't related to this specific lecture, we will be addressing those during the open Q&A with the virtual conference attendees. And then on Friday, we have a day in the life of a seminarian, where everybody gets to actually sit in on a real class. So if you're interested in joining us for that, I would encourage you to go to www.spots.edu/virtual and register. And the registration will continue to stay open. I once again would like to take a moment just simply to thank everybody that has helped make this conference possible. We have had a lot of work put in by the administrators and staff, being led by Esther Shinoni, who is the conference committee chair. Thank you so much, Esther. Thank you as well to all the students that have worked tirelessly in preparing and being such wonderful hosts. In addition to balancing all of your classwork, I saw many of you working alongside the staff and administrators in preparing, so I am very, very grateful. Last but not least, I want to thank all the donors and benefactors for all of their support. Particularly, it's very meaningful, all those that have become monthly donors and joined the St. Alexander of Sphere group. Regardless of the amount, the commitment to support the ongoing work of the seminary is extremely meaningful, and we have almost reached 200 families from all around the world. So glory be to God. And actually, the last would be to thank both the fathers at the monastery and the mothers at the convent of St. Elizabeth for their truly sacrificial and tireless efforts. So there is coffee being served, and there is in the upstairs dining hall is the overflow because we have reached capacity here. So there is coffee being served, San Ignacio coffee. If you're joining us remotely, you can purchase your San Ignacio coffee by going to www.sanignaciocoffee.com. And Bishop Maximus, as well as Metropolitan Demetrius, will be very grateful for your support of all of the mission work. As Father said, we have a high calling as genuine Orthodox Christians to truly spread the salvific and joyful message of Christ, and all the proceeds of drinking the coffee supports our missions in Latin and South America and Africa. So, and there's a blessing in every cup, so you can start off your day with a blessing. So, it is, yes. A little interview with Bishop Maximus on Theophany. They bless all the coffee plants, the entire plantation with holy water. So, anyways, at this point we will transition to the Q&A portion. Well, Father, thank you so much. I see there's a couple hands raised here, so I'm going to go ahead straight to the audience, unless Bishop Oxentios and Metropolitan Moses.
Father, first of all, thank you very much. It was a very edifying talk. Father Vlassi, who's responsible for RT, you need to tell us if we are indeed being picked up well by the microphone on the wall. But yes. Good, okay. Father Photii, I wondered if you could comment a little bit about the let's say an appraisal of what kind of consequences it had for the general population of Greece. That is the third appearance of the cross. Obviously, for the people that attended and for the people who were already aligned with the old calendar struggle, it was a tremendous moral boost, a source of moral support, encouragement, strengthening of them. Their incentive to struggle was dynamically enhanced. But what about the general population of Greece? To what extent did this was this discussed in the press, in the theological discussions, perhaps of the state church or among the faithful, clergy, hierarchy, etc.? Do we have an objective understanding of that, or any kind of understanding of that you can comment on?
Well, first of all, I'll ask your forgiveness because I'm not an expert on the issue, but something that struck me was that in one of the, preparing for the presentation, I saw a clipping from a newspaper, a Greek newspaper, and the newspaper had the new calendar date for. It was talking about the apparition of the precious cross, so this happened, so forth. But of course, the date on the newspaper is like 2 weeks ahead. So we see that even those who had adopted the new calendar, or at least in the publication, were felt compelled to actually report on it. And I think, as Dr. Demetrius points out in his book, it was a kind of it was a catalyst. It was a positive thing. To what degree it was publicly discussed? I mean, we know that it was to some degree. To what degree? I just don't know. I can't answer that for sure. However, I think it can be safely said that the coming over of the hierarchs, because at that time, okay, there was one, but really the genuine Orthodox did not have a hierarchy, and the hierarchy came later, and so it was kind of a double thing. I think it really helped the faithful to hold on to their faith until the hierarchy came over, and also to what degree exactly I don't know, but it certainly fueled the hierarchy's desire to come over to the old calendar. Forgive me if I'm.
Thank you, and I'll add to my question just a few comments, and maybe His Eminence wants to make some comments too. But the initial struggle was that is to hold the whole calendar was confused, as you rightly pointed out in your talk. There was certain uncertainty. The state church had responded with a very strong arm and sending police and militia to try to squash the protest movement as they saw it, which was, I think they thought would be an easy victory. But up into the 50s, the old calendar struggle from this galvanizing event, and while we don't have official, of course, census information to prove this, but nevertheless, in most literature, as I understand, people have said that it constituted a good half of the church. Much more than it does nowadays, unfortunately. But and that's a separate issue. The divisions within the old calendar fold could probably be largely to blame for the loss of the popular support in that way. But because very much of this event, as I understand it, up until the middle of the 20th century, the old calendarists numbered in somewhere near 50% of the population. If you want to comment about this at all.
The only thing I know about is, what's the bishops, the bishops were trying to negotiate for the state church simply to return. And they had hopes that they would cause the state church to return to the traditional calendar.
Which was a viable hope.
Yeah, it was.
But it didn't happen. And as you probably know, it was in 1934 or 35. It was St. Chrysostom of Florina saw like 30,000 or 40,000 people show up for the blessing of the waters for Theophany. And so he was very moved. And he said, "They're sheep without a shepherd." And so that's what inspired him and the other bishops to form the synod. Well, right away, the state church reacted very aggressively, and they were the first ones to say that all of the old calendars were without grace. They were schismatics and everything else. So you had it was very confusing, and it was very intense. The struggle was very intense. And the state church was out maneuvering basically the old calendars as much, well, the traditionalists. I don't like using that term because it's the traditional calendar versus what I think effectively one should say is a Gnostic calendar, because the people who brought it in were Masons. Freemasonry is a new form of Gnosticism, and so basically that's the effective thing because it brought in ecumenism. But having said that little parenthetical statement, so options. So in their local village, they were worn down, and they would basically be absorbed by the state church. You got to remember that externally, the state church had priests that, from every external, attribute, they looked traditional, and things became, much more secular and cynical in later times. But it's just that it's a war of attrition, unfortunately. So there's nothing I can cite that's like an official history or anything, but from my conversations with older people about how they had just sort of a vague inkling. And in fact, I know there's one of the monks at the monastery in Boston. When I was he's now actually father with Bishop Sergius, his Father John. His grandfather just stopped going to church. And he didn't really articulate why he stopped going to church. Well, the church he stopped going to was the Greek Diocese in Texas. And so then when the person I'm thinking of was like, it's Father John, who he's just a simple monk. He finally put it together only like for himself, and then explained to his mother about how, this is back in the 70s, how, do you know why your father stopped going to church? And so then it was like people didn't have information, and then life went on, and they thought that they were following the church, but they were being pulled away. I hope I didn't talk too long, but it's just this being worn down.
Yeah, and it seems like, as your eminence says, thank you for. It seems like that's a great temptation for even for faithful today. They see schisms in the church, and too often they're ready to just throw their hands up and say, this isn't Christianity. It's not even worth pursuing it. From what you said, that it is clear that this apparition of the precious cross gave strength to these faithful who are really dealing with some very difficult just situations in terms of just knowing what is right. And forgive me for something that I forgot to mention was that the calendar, whether it's a dogmatic issue or not, that was a debate as well. I mean, either you can take it, but it was a debate, whether we like it or not. So how dogmatic it was, and of course the miracle of this apparition is that what it showed the faithful and the Greeks at large, almost half, about half of the population of Greece, is that the old calendar is just like a tip of the iceberg. Okay, even if you argue dogmatic or not, but there's much more going under the surface. So these faithful became basically the vanguard, the first guard in preserving orthodoxy, even though they were trying to feel their way around this whole situation. Forgive me if I missed this one.
Yes, Father John.
Well, as we were talking, as Metropolitan Moses was talking and everybody was talking, and about people falling away from the church for lack of priests and due to schism, it underlines for me how important the seminary is and all of these related efforts are, and the godly courage we have to strive after to do the work of the church in such a time as this, because our love for our fellow man should motivate us, imperfect though we be, to strive to do that work so people won't turn from the faith, so that people see, there's the church. It might be in someone's garage, but there's services happening, right? even in a humble situation, and we just press on with God's help.
Thank you. We had a question, Peter?
Yes. Thank you for your talk, Father. You had mentioned, you said you don't think that there's as many ecumenists as we might think, and I actually agree with you. I think many of my friends and relatives who are Orthodox but are not part of our genuine church are also not in favor of ecumenism, and they also denounce very similar things, but a lot of them seem to get very caught up on officialdom and to be canonical, and they will often call us uncanonical, and they'll say, well, we don't want to be outside of the church, and I think that issue is very confusing for a lot of people, including our own ourselves. So I guess the question is, how do you deal with that kind of concern about when people say, well, you're not in the church and you're not canonical?
Well, without going into detail, as it were, but we as genuine Orthodox, we're not the ones who change things. If you think about it, we are just preserving orthodoxy. So we're not the ones who have to answer for canonicity. Now, the other thing is that, which is why I mentioned, this officialdom. I mean, it was the same during the Arian struggle. This official canonicity. Metropolitan Chrysostomos had a saying that he often repeated. He said that in the church, prophecy trumps order. Right, and we always have to understand that the spirit is what is important. Now, you can see that even with the situation of the Russian Orthodox Church abroad, they were, for the longest time, they were kind of in limbo. They were, on the one hand, they were in communion with people who were, innovators, but they were definitely of a traditional stance, and I was really struck by a comment Archbishop Averki said, when they were having a synod, specifically with Archbishop Leontios of Chile, his consecrations. Well, Archbishop Averki actually prophetically in that synod, this is in the early 60s, he said, to give a broader context, right? The bishops of the Russian Orthodox Church abroad, many of them were scandalized. They were saying, you didn't do this with permission, you didn't, scandalized by the actions of Archbishop Leontio of Chile in consecration, which he did with another bishop. It was legitimate. Consecration of whom? Consecration of bishops of the a hierarchy for the old calendars, Greek old calendars at the time. Forgive me for not making that clear. But the main point is that Archbishop Averki, when the bishops are discussing, and it was a heated debate, Archbishop Averki said, look, we have to sink into the spirit of the canons, right? Right now there are many situations that are, canonically difficult just by the way the world's structure. For instance, in the United States, think about it. Canonically speaking, strictly, you should have only one bishop in the city, right? But with the different immigrants and whatnot, this can't always be kept to the letter. So he stressed that we have to follow the spirit of the canons, right? But also to a very more basic point, and I would, by the way, I would highly recommend Dr. Dimitri's book, the Frequently Asked Questions about the genuine Orthodox Christians. He really discusses those questions in a very good way. But fundamentally speaking, we are canonical. We have apostolic succession, right? I mean, fundamentally, you can't accuse us of that, of non-canonicity. And I just don't have time to show all the proofs and the history of this, but we do. Now, sorry, one last point, not to beat the dead horse, as it were, but canonicity, forgive me. I'll just pass on it. I'll pass on it if I can.
Yes, just to follow up on this question, because you're right, Panagiotis, we hear that very often, and we know that that argument is put forward by even people who should be aligned with us, to accuse us, to say that, well, we're sympathetic to the old calendrists, but well, after all, they're uncanonical.
They're schismatics, and so how could you lend them your support or join them? Father Photii very nicely illustrated the very confusing situation in the 4th century. And what did our hero, St. Basil the Great, do in the face of similar questions? Well, needless to say, canonicity then, or as it were, who the official church was very confusing, because at times on the throne in Constantinople or Antioch or Alexandria, these great centers of Christianity, you had hierarchs officially sanctioned by the state who were heretical, Arians, or later Nestorians. And they were so-called the official church at the time. How did St. Basil labor against that? Did he say, well, you may seem to be, did he focus on this question of officialdom? No, he did not. And our great fathers did not either. They focused on the question of orthodoxy. In other words, correct doctrine, correct preaching of the truth. And when they wrote polemically against Arius himself or those who followed him or Nestorius, etc., they did not try to, they did not accept the red herring of an issue as their supposed official support in the fact that the emperor endorsed them or supported their elevation to their see, and therefore made them the local head of the church and the local official church. That was completely inconsequential from their perspective. They simply addressed the issue of what you are preaching, Arius, Nestorius, etc., and wrote against that and said, this is not Orthodox doctrine, and this is why. And therefore, that's our duty as well. Oh, okay, fine, they may actually occupy the throne of Constantinople or of Moscow or of Antioch and Alexandria and so on, and be able, that's a Western model. Basically, it's Roman. Whoever holds the throne in Rome, basically, is the church and has the right to speak without being challenged authoritatively, infallibly even, in modern arguments, about the supposed correct teaching. We do not give our patriarchs such authority. If they fulfilled their calling, yes, then as some of the great saints who are patriarchs, St. Photius himself, they speak for the church. But they speak because of their oneness with Christ, not because of the so-called officialdom that they hold.
A good example, forgive me for interjecting, St. Maximus the Confessor. He was told, look, which patriarchate are you with? All of them are, at that time, monopolized. And he said, I belong to the Catholic Church. And thank you, Your Eminence, and thank you very much, Your Eminence, that you helping me out with this. But forgive me, I get pretty tired after a talk like that, and my brain isn't functioning. What I was going to say, and I don't know how I got off track, but Archbishop Averki in the synod in the 60s, he told the Russian bishops, he says, look, we have to delve into the spirit of the canons, right? And he says that by pursuing, and this was really prophetic, he says, by pursuing officialdom and the letter of the canons, it might be very soon that we find ourselves with the enemies of the church. And when I read it, I was very surprised how he explained that. And forgive me, I was going to move on to that point, but I forgot.
From our standpoint, absolutely prophetic. Yes.
Yeah.
I have a couple questions from our online audience, and then we'll circle back to our participants here at the seminary. One of the questions that came in is, there are some Greek blogs that are operated by the New Calendar Church who have openly attacked the Third Apparition of the Cross in 1925, claiming that it was a demonic apparition intended to persuade the old calendarists to remain in their schism from the canonical church. How would you respond to this? Can the demons, in fact, create a facade or image of the sign which eternally burns them?
Well, I mean, I think the question has been partially answered by the person asking. But it is worth addressing. I mean, first of all, it's actually hard to prove something that's so obvious. That's the first problem. But I mean, there are many ways of answering this. One of them is actually to the very basics of what happens with a demonic apparition, right? A demonic apparition, we are told by the fathers, creates what? Confusion, right? Fear, confusion. You become confused. That is not what we see with the people there. Think about it. People who are coming with an evil motive, right, to arrest the faithful, right, to do violence to people, are converted and start glorifying God. How can, what? Would the devil really, would the devil who's, well, as they rightly say, is burned by the cross, would he be inspiring people to sing praises to the cross and cross themselves? And it's just, basically it's so obvious that, forgive me, I'm sure I could come up with all kinds of other things. But even in terms of, I'm out of kind of my water here, but even the light that's described, the color of the light. Now, we understand that, these are spiritual things. So it's, when we talk about, colors and, spiritual visions, they're more than just, our, color spectrum. But, some of the fathers talk about demonic apparitions having that reddish color, and even even the light of the cross is just the faithful, right? There were the police, of course. There were, by the way, they actually took a picture of like the people present for I think for future generation. It's just this mass of people who saw the cross, and you understand the testimony is so important because because people had something to lose, as it were, right? Your position maybe, right, as a cadet or whatever, but there were also people. Okay, Omonia Square. So the bus driver who saw in Omonia Square. Omonia Square is downtown Athens, and people saw it. That's how public it was. Again, I don't know. I can't account for every single person who was there, but no, they all saw it. It was clear, and not just there, but outside.
I've never heard of somebody's also. Like I said, having said that, I was there. Unfortunately, I didn't see it. As happens, for example, with the Holy Fire. Not everybody sees that, but for this appearance, I know of no such testimony. No.
Father, you, at the beginning of the talk, you briefly touched on the first two appearances of the cross and explained, that for St. Constantine, it served as a catalyst in some ways for the establishment of the church and the conversion of the empire. And then you started to explain the second appearance that lasted for a much longer time. What was the effect, or what is the significance of the second appearance, though, in Jerusalem?
Well, the more important thing is that it was a very complicated time in church history. You understand, even St. Cyril of Jerusalem, so he was ordained by an Arian, right? Which again, it's a confusing time. And anyway, so the faithful are suffering. You understand, there's also the struggle against paganism, right? Not that, granted, the church is getting legitimacy. It's not the official religions in 350 yet, right? It is gaining ascendancy, but it has not been proclaimed as the official religion of the empire. So you have pagans, Jews who were also resentful of the Christian influence. I think it was the same as the third apparition in terms of giving strength to persecuted Christians, persecuted Orthodox, at a time when Emperor Constantius was very favorable to the Arians, And you have to remember, Orthodox bishops were being exiled, and again, it was just the same difficult situation for the church.
But couldn't the Arians have said that the cross was supporting their side? I guess how did that support the Orthodox?
You know, I try to investigate that actually. You know, to what degree? And well, certainly St. Cyril of Jerusalem wrote a letter to Emperor Constantius and actually mitigated some of the persecution of Orthodox, or you know, to an extent.
St. Cyril is Orthodox.
And St. Cyril is, you know, obviously Orthodox in his, you know, okay, he was obviously St. Cyril is Orthodox, so that is why it gave legitimacy to the struggle against Arianism.
I see.
Yeah.
So it appeared in St. Cyril's...
Of course, it was during his tenure, right? And of course, he's Orthodox. Again, forgive me for not clarifying that, but even though he was consecrated by, or you know, ordained by an Arian, he was obviously Orthodox. It was a confusing time.
He had affirmed his orthodoxy.
I'm sorry?
St. Cyril had affirmed his orthodoxy, as happened with St. Meletios. Similar situation, taking the throne.
We have another question from our online audience, and then we'll go back to the audience here. Thank you for the wonderful lecture, Father. Debates about heresies and the split between New and Old Calendar Orthodox sometimes alienate those who may be otherwise interested in Orthodoxy. Aside from having strength in our own conviction in the true faith, can you say a bit more about how we can or should respond to non-Orthodox and former Orthodox who have fallen away from the Church, who argue that these are political, pedantic issues which are superfluous to what is truly essential for our salvation?
I mean, it's always a very difficult situation because people use that as an people use divisions in the Church as an excuse, and you can't deny that divisions, heresies, they scandalize not just those faithful, but also those who are not Christians, not Orthodox Christians, right? Because they see and they say, well, all of you are just fighting with each other. In fact, Julian the Apostate, he brought back Orthodox bishops from exile precisely in order to create confusion in the Church. Right? St. Athanasius was exiled. He was brought back to Alexandria in order so that, as Julian said, I want to see them fight like dogs, right? In order to scandalize the pagans, and so that the pagans would adopt paganism, which Julian the Apostate wanted to do, right? So you can't deny that. And I think we should really think about the fact that is why the devil sees this as such a useful tool. Heresy is just such a useful tool to cause dissension, scandalize people. Now, well, I know if you get down to the bottom of it, well, what about Christ? People were scandalized and are scandalized about Christ too, right? And he's God, and he acted perfectly in his life. Well, the truth will be assaulted no matter what. I don't know how. It's an important question, but we have to kind of get down to the basics of it.
Okay, thank you.
I just to answer that, our Lord said, "I'm the way, the truth, and the life." So He's the truth, and so when you have, St. John Chrysostom interprets the parable of the pearl of great price found within the field. And I just had a conversation with a man that's straddling the Greek Archdiocese and returning to traditional Orthodoxy. I said, I know you love being with your family, but in that parable, St. John Chrysostom points out that the man, in order to acquire the pearl of great price, which signifies the singleness of truth, he had to sell everything he had in order to buy that field. So that's the price we have to pay. Otherwise, we're not going to possess the pearl of great price. We have to be willing to do whatever it takes, not our terms, God's terms. And so, there's certain things we can't compromise. We can love other people. We try to say it in the nicest ways and be compassionate, which I think is really important. But say, okay, our will needs to conform to God's will. And so it's like, I'm not trying to win an argument. I'm just trying to be faithful to Christ. Okay, so this is what the fathers teach. Study the fathers, see what they did. Because when Bishop Maxentius explained about how to navigate difficult things, I really was happy with his answer. But I have a real simple answer. What would St. Basil do? Would he agree with any heretic? No, but he was this type of person that his whole life, he surrendered his whole life to serve the Christians, to serve the poor, to establish monasteries, to teach people. So it was all an act of love. And like St. Photii said, the greatest act of love is to speak the truth. That's in his letter to the Pope Nicholas. So we have to speak the truth, but with love. With, what is it St. Peter says? With fear. We have to be ready to speak. Of the reason of the hope within us, but with fear, with humility, not like the whole thing about triumphalism. Well, it's like, Christ triumphed. I'm just following him. Like I'm a follower. Christ is the one who triumphed. So.
Thank you, Your Eminence.
Yes, thank you. I just had a question if any of the apparitions of the cross relate to any prophecies, or if there's like a certain number that'll be until the end of the world or something like that.
Not that I've come across, not that I've heard of. Though it is interesting. I've kind of thought about the fact that think about how long it's been. The two apparitions happened in the 4th century, and then you have 16 centuries right down the road. It's almost, there's almost kind of an incentive, right? Like momentous things are happening in the church right now, and what are we doing? How are we relating to those momentous events?
Yes, Michael.
My question is kind of connected to his. It was pretty interesting that you stated that the first two apparitions were during the day, and that this one was during the night. Do you think there's any significance to that, in that at this time there was more darkness throughout the world, which was evident in like 20 years later, there was World War II, things along those lines?
I mean, you could. I mean, again, you could look at it that way. I mean, again, it's like really up to I can't really say. That was a comment. I mean, it's not an impious thought. You could see it that way.
I was just wondering if there's any writings or anything.
Not that I'm aware of. Not that I'm aware of. Right? Though I could have, I'm sure in a homily somewhere maybe somebody elaborated on it, but not that I know of.
At this point in time, I'd like to thank you once again, and I'd like to thank His Eminence Metropolitan Moses and His Eminence Bishop Maxentius for helping and contributing to the question and answers. We're going to adjourn this session. I would remind everybody that after dinner, at 7:30, there is a meet and greet with the seminary faculty, so you can follow up and ask your questions then. For those of you that have taken the time to join us virtually, thank you. If you are watching on YouTube, go ahead and register again at spots.edu/virtual, and then you'll be able to join us for the next 2 days. We have many more edifying lectures, Q&A sessions, and thank you once again for all your time and attention.